March 17, 1944. The intelligence report lay on the conference table in the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's field headquarters deep in the East Prussian forest. Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring stood near the window, unusually quiet for a man known for bombast. General Adolf Galland, inspector of fighters for the Luftwaffe, watched as Hitler's fingers moved across the page, tracing columns of numbers that seemed to defy comprehension. American fighter aircraft production, January through December 1943. 7,065 Republic P, 47 Thunderbolts, 6,908 North American P, 51 Mustangs, 4,186 Lockheed P, 38 Lightnings. In a single year, the Americans had built more fighters than the Luftwaffe possessed in total across all fronts. What Hitler said in that moment, and in the terrible months that followed as the true scale of American industrial power became undeniable, revealed the collapse of every assumption upon which he had built his war. The fighter he had dismissed as impossible was now darkening German skies by the thousands, flown by pilots he called incapable, built by a nation he had mocked as weak. 3 years earlier, Hitler's view of American military production had been clear and unwavering. When President Franklin Roosevelt stood before Congress on January 6, 1941, 11 months before Pearl Harbor, and called for production of 50,000 aircraft per year, the announcement had been met with derision in Berlin. The Reichskanzlei's intelligence analysts had compiled a report on the American aviation industry, and the numbers seemed to confirm what Hitler already believed. In 1939, total American military aircraft production had been fewer than 3,000 planes. The United States Army Air Corps possessed perhaps 1,700 aircraft total, many of them obsolete trainers and observation planes. Roosevelt's call for 50,000 aircraft seemed not just ambitious, but fantastical, the kind of propaganda statement democracies made to disguise their fundamental weakness. Hitler had read the intelligence assessment with satisfaction. 50,000 aircraft, he said to his inner circle, according to accounts recorded in his table talks. The Americans cannot even organize their own economy. They have just emerged from a depression that crippled their industry for a decade. They have no military tradition, no understanding of modern warfare. This is Roosevelt's desperation speaking. Göring, already styling himself as a master of the Luftwaffe and the architect of German air superiority, had been even more dismissive. In a meeting with aircraft manufacturers in 1941, he had famously remarked that Americans can build automobiles and refrigerators, but they cannot build proper military aircraft. Their industrial culture is suited for consumer goods, not weapons of war. The assessment wasn't entirely unfounded. American industry in 1940 had indeed been oriented toward civilian production. The United States was manufacturing more automobiles than any nation on earth, more tractors, more washing machines, more radios. But military aircraft required precision, specialized materials, skilled labor, and above all, a ruthless efficiency that the German High Command believed only a militarized state could achieve. The Luftwaffe in 1940 possessed the most advanced air force in the world. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 had proven itself in Spain, in Poland, in France. The Junkers Ju-88 bomber was a masterpiece of German engineering. German pilots were veterans of actual combat, not peacetime exercises. German factories have been producing military aircraft for years, refining processes, building expertise. The idea that America, with its democratic squabbling and industrial chaos, could match German production, let alone exceed it, seemed absurd. But even as Hitler dismissed American capabilities, something was already happening across the Atlantic that would transform Roosevelt's seemingly impossible promise into terrifying reality. The American aircraft industry in 1940 employed roughly 190,000 workers. Within 4 years, that number would exceed 2 million. Factories that built automobiles retooled overnight to produce aircraft components. The Ford Motor Company's massive Willow Run plant, built specifically for bomb production, would eventually produce B-24 Liberators at a rate of 1 aircraft per hour. Henry Kaiser's shipyards applied assembly line techniques to aircraft construction on a scale no nation had attempted. The transformation was so rapid, so total, that it defied everything the German high command understood about industrial production. By 1942, as German forces drove deep into the Soviet Union and U-boats prowled the Atlantic, the first intelligence reports about actual American production began reaching Berlin. The numbers were startling. American military aircraft production for 1942 totaled 47,000 aircraft. Not Roosevelt's promised 50,000, but close enough to prove the promise hadn't been empty rhetoric. More importantly, the trend was accelerating. Monthly production was increasing. New factories were coming online. Training programs were producing pilots by the thousands. The reports noted something else troubling. The aircraft themselves were improving. The early American fighters that had struggled against Zeros in Pacific and Messerschmitts in North Africa were being replaced by new designs. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a massive single-engine fighter built around a 2,000 horsepower radial engine, was entering service. The P-51 Mustang, originally designed for British, was being adopted by the Americans and fitted with Rolls-Royce Merlin engines that transformed its performance. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Hitler's initial response to these reports had been to question their accuracy. "The figures are inflated," he told his staff, according to Albert Speer's later testimony. "American propaganda to boost morale and frighten us. We've seen this before. They claim capabilities they don't possess." But Göring, for all his faults, understood aircraft production. He knew the reports couldn't be entirely fabricated. In a private conversation with Speer in late 1942, he admitted concern. "If these numbers are even half accurate," he said, "we have a problem. Our entire fighter production for 1942 will be less than 15,000 aircraft. If the Americans are truly producing 3 times that number, and the British another 20,000, the mathematics become difficult." The mathematics were indeed difficult, and they were about to become impossible. American fighter production in 1943 reached levels that made the 1942 numbers look modest. Republic Aviation's factories in Farmingdale and Evansville produced P-47 Thunderbolts at an accelerating rate. North American Aviation's plants in Inglewood and Dallas churned out P-51 Mustangs. Lockheed's Burbank facility built P-38 Lightnings. And these were just the major fighters. Bell Aircraft produced thousands of P-39 Airacobras, many destined for the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease. Curtiss manufactured P-40 Warhawks for Allied air forces worldwide. The intelligence reports reaching Hitler's headquarters in early 1944 painted a picture that should have been impossible. In 1943 alone, the United States had produced approximately 85,000 aircraft of all types. Fighters alone numbered in the tens of thousands. The P-47 production for 1943 had exceeded 6,500 aircraft. The P-51, ramping up production, had reached several thousand. The P-38 had added thousands more. And behind these numbers lay something even more troubling: capacity. The Americans weren't producing at maximum capacity. They were still building factories, still training workers, still refining processes. The production levels of 1943 weren't a peak. They were a plateau before another climb. Hitler received the Comprehensive Intelligence Assessment in March 1944. The report had been compiled by Foreign Armies West, the Wehrmacht intelligence section responsible for monitoring the Western Allies. It was thorough, detailed, and devastating. The report confirmed that in 1944, American fighter production would exceed all previous years. Projected production for the P-47 alone was estimated at over 7,000 aircraft. The P-51 would match or exceed that number. The P-38 would add thousands more. Combined with bomber production, transport aircraft, and training planes, total American aircraft production for 1944 would approach 100,000 aircraft. The numbers were accompanied by analysis that made them even more ominous. The report noted that American fighters were no longer the inferior machines they had been in 1942. The P-47D, now the standard variant, possessed a top speed of 440 miles per hour and a ceiling of 40,000 feet. It carried 850 caliber machine guns and could haul bombs and rockets for ground attack. The P-51D, with its bubble canopy and Merlin engine, could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, something Göring had declared impossible. The P-38, with its twin-boom design and twin engines, offered range and firepower that made it deadly in both air-to-air combat and ground attack. But it wasn't just the quality of individual aircraft that made the report so alarming. It was the system behind them. American factories had achieved a level of production efficiency that dwarfed German capabilities. The report detailed how Republic Aviation had streamlined P-47 production to the point where airframes were assembled in days rather than weeks. Components arrived from subcontractors across the country, precisely machined to tolerances that ensured interchangeability. Workers trained in weeks could perform specialized tasks that would have required months of apprenticeship in German factories. The entire American industrial system had been reoriented toward a single goal, producing more aircraft faster than the enemy could destroy them. Hitler read the report in silence. Those present, including Speer and General Jodl, later recalled the scene. Hitler's face remained impassive as he studied the production figures, the projected totals, the assessments of American industrial capacity. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost reflective. 7,000 fighters in 1 year, he said. From a single model, we will be fortunate to produce 12,000 fighters total across all models in 1944. He looked up at Göring, who stood near the window, his earlier bombast replaced by uncomfortable silence. You told me the Americans could only build refrigerators. Göring shifted his weight. Intelligence may be exaggerated, my Führer. American sources tend to inflate their capabilities. Hitler's eyes narrowed. Do not insult my intelligence with the same comforting lies you've been telling yourself. The evidence is overwhelming. The Americans are doing exactly what they said they would do. They are outproducing us by orders of magnitude. He stood, pacing to the large map of Europe that dominated one wall of the conference room. Do you know what 7,000 fighters means? It means that for every Messerschmitt we produce, they produce 2 Thunderbolts. For every Focke-Wulf, 2 Mustangs. We shoot down one, they send 3 more. We destroy a factory. They have 5 others producing the same aircraft. The reality Hitler was confronting wasn't just about numbers. It was about the fundamental nature of modern industrial warfare. The German aircraft industry, for all its technical sophistication, was fragmented across dozens of manufacturers, each protecting their own designs and production methods. Coordination was hampered by competing bureaucracies, resource shortages, and Hitler's own tendency to interfere in technical decisions. The Luftwaffe had outstanding aircraft. The Focke-Wulf FW-190 was arguably the best fighter in Europe when it appeared. The Me-262 jet fighter represented a technological leap beyond anything the Allies possessed. But producing these aircraft in numbers that could affect the war's outcome was a different challenge entirely. Germany's fighter production in 1944 would reach approximately 40,000 aircraft, a number that seemed impressive until compared to American production. The United States in 1944 built 96,359 aircraft of all types. Fighters alone numbered in the tens of thousands. The disparity wasn't just in raw numbers. It was in sustainability. American factories operated 3 shifts around the clock. Workers were well-fed, well-housed, motivated by both patriotism and wages that far exceeded what German workers earned. Materials arrived on schedule because American transportation networks hadn't been bombed to rubble. Skilled machinists could be trained because the United States wasn't bleeding manpower on multiple fronts. Germany, by contrast, was struggling with every aspect of production. Strategic materials like aluminum and high-grade steel were in chronic short supply. Factories faced constant disruption from Allied bombing. Skilled workers were being conscripted for military service and replaced with forced labor that lacked training and motivation. Transportation networks were breaking down under the weight of bombing and resource shortages. And underlying everything was the simple fact that Germany was fighting a multi-front war that consumed men, material, and industrial capacity faster than they could be replaced. Hitler understood this. His later conversations, recorded by various staff members and historians, showed a man grappling with the implications of American industrial supremacy. In April 1944, shortly after reviewing production figures, he met with Speer to discuss armaments production overall. The conversation turned to aircraft, and Hitler's frustration boiled over. "We built an air force to conquer Europe," he said. "We succeeded. We destroyed the Polish Air Force in days. We crushed the French. We drove the British from the continent. But we built an air force for conquest, not for defense. We never imagined we would need to replace thousands of aircraft per month against an enemy who can produce them faster than we can shoot them down." Speer, who had worked miracles increasing German armaments production despite Allied bombing, couldn't offer reassurance. German fighter production was increasing, yes, from 1,200 aircraft per month in late 1943 to potentially 2,000 per month by mid-1944. But American production was increasing faster. The gap wasn't closing. It was widening. And behind the raw production numbers lay another crisis: pilots and fuel. Germany was running out of both. Training new pilots required fuel and time, both of which were increasingly scarce. The veteran pilots who had won Germany's early victories were being killed faster than replacements could be trained. By mid-1944, Luftwaffe fighter units were receiving pilots with perhaps 30 hours of flight training, thrust into combat against American pilots with hundreds of hours of experience. The fuel situation was even more desperate. Germany's synthetic fuel plants, marvels of engineering that converted coal into gasoline, were prime targets for Allied bombers. The Plosti oil fields in Romania, Germany's primary source of natural petroleum, were under constant attack. By summer 1944, fuel shortages would force the Luftwaffe to ground aircraft not because they were damaged, but because there was no fuel to fly them. The American, by contrast, had access to seemingly unlimited petroleum. Their aircraft flew training missions that consumed more fuel than some Luftwaffe units had for combat operations. Hitler's comments about American fighter production became more bitter as the year progressed. In June 1944, as Allied forces landed in Normandy under an umbrella of air superiority provided by thousands of American and British fighters, he raged at his generals about the Luftwaffe's inability to contest the invasion. "Where are our fighters?" he demanded, according to accounts from a meeting. "Where's the air force that conquered Poland and France?" Galland, the fighter commander, gave the answer Hitler didn't want to hear. "Our fighters are there, my Führer. They are outnumbered 20-1. We send up 50 aircraft against 1,000 Allied fighters and bombers. We shoot down 10, lose 30, and they replace their losses within days. We cannot replace ours at all." The numbers Galland cited weren't exaggerations. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe managed to fly perhaps 300 sorties against the invasion force. The Allied air forces flew over 14,000. American fighters, P-47s and P-51s and P-38s, dominated the skies so completely that German pilots called the period after D-Day the Great Slaughter. Experienced pilots who had survived years of combat on the Eastern Front found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer number of Allied aircraft. "You shoot down one," a German pilot later recalled, "and 3 more take its place. You damage another, and it limps home while 2 more attack you. There was no end to them." This was the reality of American fighter production translated into combat. Every month, hundreds of new P-47s, P-51s, and P-38s arrived in England. They replaced losses, expanded squadrons, equipped new units. German fighters, by contrast, struggled to maintain existing strength. A Luftwaffe squadron that started in 1944 with 40 aircraft might end the year with 20, not because they couldn't produce replacements, but because pilot losses outpaced pilot training, and fuel shortages grounded aircraft even when pilots were available. Hitler's recognition of this disparity came too late to change anything. By mid-1944, Germany's strategic situation was hopeless. The Eastern Front was collapsing under Soviet offensives. The Western Front had been breached at Normandy. Allied bombers were systematically destroying what remained of German industry. And overhead, American fighters ruled the skies, not through individual superiority, German pilots often had better training and sometimes better aircraft, but through overwhelming numbers backed by an industrial system Germany could never match. The intelligence report from March 1944 had included a detail that perhaps summarized the entire situation better than any production statistic. It noted that in 1944, the United States would produce more aircraft than Japan had produced during the entire war from 1937 to 1944. In a single year, American factories would exceed Japan's 7-year total. Germany's production, while higher than Japan's, couldn't compete with American output either. The report's authors had concluded with a statement that was both obvious and devastating. The enemy possesses industrial capacity that exceeds the combined production of all Axis powers. Victory through attrition is no longer possible. Hitler had underlined that final sentence. Then, according to those who saw the document later, he had written in the margin a single word, when. The question wasn't about when Germany would lose. Hitler knew the answer to that. The question was when the collapse would become total, when the accumulation of American fighters overhead would make further resistance not just futile, but physically impossible. The answer came in stages throughout 1944, each more devastating than the last. In February, during what became known as Big Week, American bombers escorted by hundreds of fighters struck German aircraft factories in a coordinated campaign designed to cripple fighter production at its source. The Luftwaffe rose to defend its factories, and in 6 days of intense combat, lost nearly 600 fighters and hundreds of irreplaceable pilots. The Americans lost approximately 250 bombers and fighter aircraft. Within weeks, they had replaced every loss. The Luftwaffe never recovered. Hitler received daily reports of the losses. Göring, by now a shadow of his former self, offered increasingly desperate explanations. The weather had favored the Allies. The attacks had caught them by surprise. German production would recover, but the reports from the factories told a different story. Messerschmitt's Regensburg plant had been heavily damaged. The Focke-Wulf facility at Oschersleben was in ruins. Across Germany, aircraft production was disrupted not just by direct hits on factories, but by damage to the broader industrial infrastructure. Power plants, transportation hubs, machine tool factories, all the complex web of industry that supported aircraft production was being systematically destroyed. What made it worse was that Hitler could see the results overhead. By spring 1944, American fighters were appearing over Germany in formations that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. 100-plane fighter sweeps ranged ahead of bomber formations, hunting for Luftwaffe fighters. The P-51 Mustang, with its sleek profile and teardrop canopy, had become the dominant American fighter. Its range allowed it to escort bombers anywhere in Germany. Its performance allowed it to fight on equal terms with the best German fighters. And there were so many of them. German fighter pilots began reporting encounters that revealed the scale of American production in human terms. A FW-190 pilot might dive on a bomber formation only to find himself facing 30 or 40 P-51s. He might shoot down one, damage another, and then be forced to flee as a dozen more converged on him. The sky was full of them. One German ace recalled. Everywhere you looked, more American fighters. You couldn't engage because you were instantly outnumbered. You couldn't run because they were as fast as you were. You couldn't hide because they hunted in packs. This tactical reality was the direct result of American production numbers. With thousands of fighters arriving in England every month, American commanders could afford tactics that would have been impossible for Germany. Fighters could be sent on sweeps without bombers, deep into Germany, hunting for the Luftwaffe. Damaged aircraft could be written off rather than repaired if newer models were available. Pilots who needed more training could get it because there were enough other pilots to maintain operational strength. Every advantage the Luftwaffe had enjoyed in 1940 and 41, numerical superiority, veteran pilots, tactical flexibility, had been reversed by sheer industrial output. Hitler's frustration with this situation exploded in meetings throughout spring and summer 1944. He demanded explanations from Göring for the Luftwaffe's failure to stop the bombing. He ordered the development of new superweapons that would reverse the tide. He fixated on the Me-262 jet fighter, believing its technological superiority would offset numerical inferiority. But even when he was presented with the jet's capabilities, the production numbers told a discouraging story. Germany might produce 100 jets per month by late 1944. The Americans were producing 1,000 conventional fighters per month. The mathematics remained brutal. Speer tried to explain the reality during a meeting in May 1944. "My Führer," he said, according to his later testimony, "the Americans have transformed their entire economy into a war machine. Every factory, every worker, every resource is directed toward production. They don't face the constraints we face. They have unlimited oil, unlimited aluminum, unlimited manpower. Their factories aren't being bombed. Their workers aren't being conscripted. They can focus entirely on production, while we must divide resources between production and survival." Hitler's response revealed both his understanding and his inability to accept the implications. "You're telling me," he said, his voice rising, "that we cannot match American production because our entire situation is different, because we are fighting in the East and the West while they sit safely across an ocean building factories, because we are being bombed while they bomb others, because we are stretched thin while they have unlimited resources." He slammed his hand on the table. "I know all this. Do you think I don't understand the situation? The question is what we do about it." But there was nothing to do. The industrial and strategic reality couldn't be changed by force of will. Germany in 1944 was producing impressive numbers of aircraft despite overwhelming obstacles. The 40,000 aircraft built that year represented a triumph of German engineering and industrial determination. But it wasn't enough. It could never be enough against an enemy that could produce more than twice that number while simultaneously building ships, tanks, artillery, and supplies in quantities that dwarfed Axis production. The human cost of this industrial disparity became clear in the summer of 1944. The Allied invasion of France succeeded in part because the Luftwaffe couldn't contest air superiority. German fighters appeared over Normandy in handfuls, while hundreds of Allied fighters patrolled overhead. Every German sortie became a desperate mission with slim chances of return. Veteran pilots, survivors of years of combat, died trying to stop invasions they couldn't hope to effect. New pilots, barely trained, lasted days or even hours in combat before being shot down by opponents who had better training, better support, and above all, more aircraft. If you find the story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By August 1944, Hitler's comments about American fighters had shifted from frustration to a bitter acknowledgment of reality. In a meeting with his military staff, discussing the collapse of German forces in France, he made a statement that several witnesses recorded. "The Americans have won the war of production," he said. "Not the war of soldiers, not the war of courage or skill, but the war that matters most in modern conflict. They can build aircraft faster than we can destroy them. They can train pilots faster than we can kill them. They can replace losses faster than we can inflict them. Everything else is just delaying the inevitable." This recognition didn't lead to surrender or even serious peace negotiations. Hitler's ideology wouldn't allow it. But it did mark a shift in German strategy from seeking victory to inflicting maximum cost, making the Allies pay in blood for every mile of German territory. The Luftwaffe's role in the strategy was to delay, to disrupt, to make American bomber crews understand that German skies would never be safe. But even this limited goal was undermined by the production disparity. German fighter pilots in late 1944 were flying aircraft that were often superior to their American opponents. The FW-100 90D-9, introduced in late summer, could match or exceed the P-51 in most performance categories. The Me-262, when it finally entered combat in meaningful numbers, was untouchable by conventional fighters. But there were never enough of these advanced aircraft. For every FW-100 90D, 9 Germany produced, America built 10 P-51s. For every Me-262 that entered service, 100 Thunderbolts and Mustangs patrolled German skies. The intelligence reports continued throughout the fall. September's report showed American fighter production maintaining its pace. 7,000 P-47s for the year, nearly 7,000 P-51s, over 4,000 P-38s. October's report added bomb production, transport aircraft, training planes. The total for 1944 would exceed 96,000 aircraft. Germany's total would be 40,000. The ratio was worse than 2 to 1. And behind those numbers lay the even more disturbing reality that American production wasn't declining. If anything, it was still increasing. Hitler's last recorded comments about American fighter production came in November 1944, during a meeting about the Ardennes Offensive, the last major German counterattack of the war. The plan called for a rapid armored thrust through weak American positions in Belgium, driving Antwerp and splitting the Allied armies. Success depended on several factors, including whether that would ground Allied air power. Hitler knew this. Everyone knew this. The Luftwaffe couldn't provide air cover against American fighters in clear weather. The best Germany could hope for was fog and clouds that would keep the P-47s and P-51s on the ground. Our entire offensive depends on weather, Hitler said. According to notes from a meeting, we must attack during a period when the Americans cannot fly. Because if they fly, if their fighters appear overhead, our columns will be destroyed before they reach their objectives. He paused, then added a sentence that summarized his entire understanding of American air power. We are not fighting the American army. We are fighting American factories. And no amount of courage or skill can defeat an enemy who can replace everything we destroy faster than we can destroy it. The Ardennes Offensive, launched in mid-December 1944, initially succeeded because weather did ground Allied air power. German forces advanced under fog and snow, overwhelming American positions, creating panic in Allied headquarters. But the weather cleared on December 23rd. American fighters appeared overhead in hundreds, then thousands. P-47 strafed German columns. P-51 swept the skies of what few Luftwaffe fighters appeared. P-38s hunted tanks and trucks. The advance stalled, then reversed. By January, the offensive had collapsed, costing Germany irreplaceable men and equipment while accomplishing nothing. Hitler received reports of the air attacks with the resignation of a man who had seen it all before. How many sorties did they fly? He asked about one particularly devastating day. Over 8,000, came the answer, and we managed, perhaps 200. Hitler nodded. This is what production means. They can fly 40 sorties for every one of ours. And tomorrow they will do the same. And the day after, until we have nothing left. This understanding, bitter and complete, marked Hitler's final assessment of American fighter production. He had started the war believing American industry was weak, its workers soft, its systems inefficient. He had maintained this belief even as evidence accumulated against it. But by the end of 1944, denial was no longer possible. The sky overhead told the truth in a language that couldn't be misinterpreted. American fighters, thousands of them, built in factories he couldn't bomb, flown by pilots he couldn't stop, supported by an industrial system he had fatally underestimated. The P-47 Thunderbolt that Hitler had dismissed became the most produced American fighter of the war. More than 15,000 were built. The P-51 Mustang that he thought impossible because Americans couldn't build proper military aircraft numbered over 14,000. The P-38 Lightning added nearly 10,000 more. And these were just 3 models. Total American fighter production during the war exceeded 60,000 aircraft. German fighter production for the entire war was approximately 55,000. In 1944 alone, American factories built as many fighters as Germany built in 2 years. These weren't abstract statistics to the German soldiers and pilots who faced them. Every number represented an aircraft, a pilot, a mission. German soldiers on the Western Front learned to recognize the sound of American fighters overhead, the distinctive rumble of P-47 radial engines, the smooth whine of P-51 Merlins. They learned to scatter when that sound approached, to abandon vehicles, to hide in forests and buildings, because exposure meant death from above. German fighter pilots learned to calculate odds before engaging, to avoid combat unless circumstances favored them, because every fight against superior numbers reduced their chances of survival. The psychological impact of American air superiority built on industrial production, was as devastating as the physical destruction. German forces in late 1944 and 45 operated with the knowledge that the sky belonged to the enemy. Supply columns moved at night. Troop concentrations dispersed during the day. Training exercises were conducted under cover. Everything happened in the shadows, avoiding the attention of an enemy who owned the daylight hours. This wasn't the war Hitler had envisioned. This wasn't conquest and glory. This was survival under the weight of industrial supremacy, so complete that resistance seemed futile. Hitler never admitted his initial assessment of American production had been wrong. His ideology couldn't allow such an admission, but his later statements showed a man who understood the price of that misjudgment. In January 1945, during one of his final military conferences, he made a comment that several staff members recorded. "If we had understood what the Americans could do," he said, "if we had seen their industrial capacity for what was rather than what we wanted to be, we might have made different decisions. But we believed our own propaganda about American weakness, and now we pay the price." The price was total. By April 1945, the Luftwaffe had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Fuel shortages grounded most aircraft. Pilot losses had created squadrons with more planes than qualified pilots. Allied fighters roamed German skies at will, strafing anything that moved. The factories that built the P-47s, P-51s, and P-38s continued their work, though by then many of the aircraft they produced would never see combat. The war was ending not because Germany ran out of courage or skill, but because it had been buried under an avalanche of production it could never match. Hitler's last days in the Führer bunker in Berlin were accompanied by the sound of Allied aircraft overhead. Soviet bombers struck at the dying city, but mixed with them were American and British fighters and bombers, still attacking targets even as ground forces closed in. The fighters he had dismissed as propaganda in 1940, the production numbers he had called impossible, the industrial supremacy he had refused to acknowledge. All of it was real. All of it was overhead. All of it proved that modern war wasn't won by ideology or will or even tactical brilliance. It was won by factories, workers, resources, and the ruthless arithmetic of production. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler committed suicide. 8 days later, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The American fighters that had darkened German skies since early 1944 continued their patrols, but now over peaceful skies, their mission accomplished. The factories that built them, the workers who assembled them, the industrial system that produced them in impossible numbers, had done what Hitler said couldn't be done. They had built not just fighters, but an air force so large and so capable that it overwhelmed German resistance through sheer mass. The final accounting tells a story with brutal clarity. Total American fighter production during World War II exceeded 60,000 aircraft. Total German fighter production was approximately 55,000, but that comparison understates the disparity. American production ramped up year by year. German production, constrained by resources, bombing, and strategic mistakes, peaked in 1944, then declined. More importantly, American fighters arrived in the theater ready to fight, supported by fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and trained pilots. German fighters too often sat grounded for lack of fuel, or pilots, or parts. In 1944 alone, the year Hitler finally confronted the reality of American industrial power, the United States built approximately 38,000 fighters. Germany built roughly 25,000. The Americans built more in 1 year than Germany managed in 2. And they did it while simultaneously building more bombers, more transports, more trainers, more of everything than Germany could match. The three main American fighters alone, P-47, P-51, and P-38, totaled nearly 18,000 aircraft in 1944. That single year's production of 3 models exceeded many nations' entire air forces. Hitler had called American production claims propaganda. He had said their industrial capacity was overrated. He had insisted that American workers couldn't match German efficiency, that American engineers couldn't design proper military aircraft, that American factories couldn't achieve the precision necessary for modern weapons. Every statement proved wrong. Every assumption failed. Every comfortable lie about American weakness evaporated in the face of P-47s and P-51s and P-38s that filled the sky in numbers that made German resistance not difficult, but impossible. What Hitler said when he learned America was building 50,000 fighters in a year evolved from mockery to denial to bitter recognition. In 1940, he laughed at Roosevelt's promises. In 1942, he questioned the intelligence reports. In 1943, he demanded explanations for why German production couldn't match American output. In 1944, he acknowledged that America had won the war of factories. And in 1945, as American fighters patrolled overhead while his empire collapsed, he fell silent. Confronted by the physical reality of an industrial supremacy he had fatally misjudged. The 50,000 fighters weren't just aircraft. They were proof that Hitler's understanding of modern warfare had been fundamentally flawed. He had built a military machine designed for quick, decisive victories against unprepared opponents. America had built an industrial system designed to win wars of attrition through overwhelming production. When those two systems collided, when Blitzkrieg met the assembly line, there was never any doubt about the outcome. The only question was how long it would take for the weight of American production to crush German resistance completely. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.